Reason and tradition, the Maimonidean paradigm. But what it is really about, it's about the possibility of living a modern Jewish life. Is that enterprise at all possible? And that was probably one of my father's overarching intellectual concerns. And the book that we're going to be studying from, or the sources that came from in particular, is a book that many of you might know, but many of you might not know, and that's his first book, entitled Maimonides' Torah and Philosophical Quest. This was his PhD. He worked on this PhD for about 20 years. And what this wasn't simply a study of Maimonides. In Maimonides, my father found the potential, I would say in many ways, for him to be a Jew. Not a Jew in an ethnic sense, but a Jew in the sense that this is a place that I can find a home. For what he was looking for, that same notion that he told me, Daniel, I didn't ask you what Rashi said, I asked you what you think. That was how he lived his life. Can I think within the context of Judaism? Or as he would often say, do I have to leave my brain at home? When I enter into tradition, do I have to shut down my brain? Is that what it demands? And initially, his fascination with Soloveitchik grew out of the fact that the rigor of Talmudic study that Soloveitchik embodied and brought into the Beit Midrash was a Talmudic study which was intellectually rigorous. It was tight, it was strong. And when Soloveitchik, and he would scream once at a student and said, you know, he asked a student a question, and the student answered, and Soloveitchik said that it's stupid. And the student said, but what do you mean? The Meiri said it. This is a medieval commentary. So he said, so the Meiri's stupid. Which is, this is, you know, that's really being wicked in orthodoxy. You know, like, wow, you said that, you know. That was like initially exciting. Ultimately, he became bored with Soloveitchik because of the limits of Soloveitchik's openness to the world and ability to integrate reason and intellectual rigor beyond the confines of the closed Beit Midrash. My father was looking for a Judaism which could look at the modern world, which could hear a truth, hear an idea, and be able to embrace it. Can that be a part of Judaism? Now, I could be a modern Jew. It's very simple. If there's one way to do it is to be schizophrenic. That's a simple way. I'll be modern whenever I want to, and Jewish whenever I want to. That's sort of like Israelis when they think about Jewish democratic. A little Jewish, a little democratic. Too much consistency is not required. I'll pay my dues to each. So I'll be modern, and I'll be traditional. Where? It depends. Depends. Sometimes it could be consistent, sometimes it won't be consistent. But I can be modern because when modernity compels me, I'll follow modernity. And very often Judaism will be bagels, pickles, if I push it, gefilte fish. If I'm a fanatic, pcha. But other than that, you don't even know what pcha is. Who knows here what pcha is? Okay, isn't that pushing it? Yeah, that's like, that's like you're a real traditionalist if you know. That's like, that's like that's an Akeda experience to eat pcha. But even to look at it. But anyway. Yeah, it's boiled calves' feet made into a gel, which for some reason in Hungary they thought this was something to eat. But all people eat it, whatever it is. But so you could be modern and Jewish. It's relatively simple. And for most Jews, there isn't a dilemma how to be modern and Jewish, because for them it's clear that modernity trumps Judaism. And there really isn't an attempt to integrate the modern call and the modern voice within a Jewish ethic. I'm modern, but I'm also Jewish. And Jewish could be I support Israel. Jewish could be I belong to a shul. Jewish could be dues. Jewish could be something that I do. It might be traditional. It might be sweet. It might be something touches me. It might be the song of my grandparents or the food. But modernity is where I really feel intellectually compelled. And consequently, we very often sell Judaism short. We don't bring that demand to my Judaism. I'm modern. That's where I bring my demand. But I'm also Jewish. My father was looking for something else, as many of us are. Can there be a modern Judaism? And the possibility of that modern Judaism, the possibility of making that claim, staking that possibility out, is what he found in Maimonides. And the reason why this issue is so important, far beyond the story that I'm going to tell today about Maimonides, is that in many ways, this is the most, I believe, the most critical question that we are facing as we look forward over the next number of decades. When we look at a Jewish world, which is increasingly or predominantly less committed, less serious, the question is, how do we compete? How does Judaism compete? What do we do? So Birthright is great. We send you to Israel on a mindless trip that touches you emotionally, hoping that it will last forever. It might. Not worthwhile to bet on that one. It opens a door. Great. Now we have for the first time people who are willing to listen. You know, as a very prominent rabbi in North America told me yesterday, he said one of the new things that the rabbinate has to deal with the fact is that being a rabbi in a shul doesn't mean that it comes with Jews. Isn't this an interesting observation? It doesn't come with Jews. So Birthright at least potentially puts people in the seats. But what's going to keep them there? In an open marketplace of ideas, why stay for Pchah? And other people have the bagels too. You know, it's like it's not ours. It really isn't Jewish food anymore, lady. It's really not going to get you very, very far. Why stay unless this tradition does something to you? And when you enter into it, not in any sense claiming that it's superior. Forget the superior language. Or forget any notion of necessity of choosing. But is there something that compels you to say, yeah, I want to be here and not there? If we can't answer that question of why be here, not in necessity terms, you have to be here because we are the only ones. That's crap. But you could be here, and by being here, there's something that excites you, something that compels you, something that touches you, something that makes you want to stay here. There isn't a chance in the world, even a third Birthright trip. And it doesn't matter if your kids marry Jews or don't marry. That's just irrelevant. It doesn't matter who they marry or where they visit. At the end of the day, when they come home, is there a there that they could say, as intelligent, educated people, I want to be here? Because if to be here is to do it for you, to do it for nostalgia, to do it for some notion of ancient peoplehood to which I'm connected, those categories are simply irrelevant. And in many ways, one of the most important philosophers who articulates the possibility of a modern Judaism, of a Judaism which has to meet that standard, is Maimonides. And what I would like to do this morning, I know there's 26 pages, and don't worry, we're not going to study all 26 today. I want to tell you the Maimonidean story. The story that my father told in this book, Torah and Philosophical Quest. And it's so interesting later on in life where you realize that so often people write doctoral theses. It's basically that which you write to get over with so that you could begin your career. It's like they say, you write a doctoral thesis for 2 people. Your 2 advisors. Well, my father wrote his doctoral thesis for 3 people. for his 2 doctoral advisors, and for himself. He wrote it for himself. This was his search. Can Torah and philosophical quest coexist? Can I, David Hartman, and through him, could every single person in this room find a home in this tradition and fully embrace modernity and Judaism as at least 2 ideas that could potentially coexist? This was Maimonides' intellectual agenda. And this is, in many ways, my father's personal religious quest. And I'd like to walk you through a story. We're going to look at sources briefly. Some of them you're going to study in greater depth afterwards. Others, just take them home and read them more fully. In the context of an hour lecture, there should hopefully be about a half hour for questions or comments, questions. I just want to hover above, and I want to frame for you more or less how you tell this story. This story starts, and some of these ideas are Aristotelian, and some of these ideas belong to other traditions. That doesn't matter. What's significant for us is that Maimonides is integrating them now into the Jewish narrative, into his Jewish narrative. The story begins in the first chapter of the Guide for the Perplexed, where Maimonides, as you know, the whole agenda of the Guide of the Perplexed was for him to find a way to rewrite and to reinterpret Scripture in a way that it is not insulting to the modern, medieval, Aristotelian human being. That was their modernity, what they knew. And you open up the Bible, and sometimes it's frankly stupid. It's just stupid. Maimonides opened it, and he was embarrassed. Now, that is also an experience that everybody in this room has. You open up chapters, and you just sort of, why did that have to be there? And you personally get connected to it when one of those chapters happens to fall on one of your kids' bar or bat mitzvahs. That's when it's personally compelling. Because otherwise, okay, it's stupid. Like, who cares? I'll read it in Hebrew, I won't notice. But if I actually have to say a Dvar Torah on this, then it's really, this is like a personal angst. But this is what the whole, you hit something. Now, nothing Maimonides felt was more stupid than when he opens up the Bible and he hears anthropomorphic claims. God has a body. He says, that's just stupid. God doesn't have a body. God can't have a body. So how is it that Genesis 1 starts by telling us that we human beings are what? Are created in the image of God. And there's a rabbinic statement which says, how do we know that Adam was created circumcised? Pretty interesting, huh? How do we know, because there is no story of Adam's circumcision, how do we know that Adam was circumcised? The answer is, go on. He wasn't. No, because he was created in the image of God.
Think about that.
File that one away. Maimonides says, this is stupid. So he says, what does image mean? He starts at the beginning, he says, there's people have thought, on page 1, that in the Hebrew language, image denotes the shape and configuration of a thing. The image means what it looks like. This supposition led them to the pure doctrine of the corporeality of God, on account of his saying, let us make man in our image after our likeness. For they thought that God has a man's form, his shape and configuration. Skip a line. They accordingly believed in it and deemed that if they abandoned this belief, they would give lie to the biblical text. Not only I'm obligated to believe it. Torah tells me God has a penis. There's nothing else I could do. This is who God is. Next paragraph. Maimonides says that's not true. The term image, on the other hand, is applied not to the form of something, but to the natural form. I mean to the notion and virtue of which a thing is constituted as a substance, that which makes the thing that thing, and becomes what it is. In other words, it's the true reality of the thing, insofar as the latter is that particular being. In man, what makes you man? In other words, when I call you in the image, it's not your physical form, it's your essence. It's that which makes you human. Now, what makes you human? It is on account of this, that notion is that from which human apprehension derives. It is on account of this intellectual apprehension that it is said of man, in the image of God created he him. What does it mean to be created in the image of God? It's not that we have God's body, it's that we have a mind. Now, not only does this save the Bible from stupidity, it completely changes or defines religious priorities. Because if our mind is that which we share with God, then all of a sudden the human mind, the ability to think, the ability to reason, is the core defining feature not only of the human condition, but it is also now elevated to the ultimate criteria. This is what's truly of value. If I think, when I think, I am doing or embodying or using that which is the divine within me. And so when I think, if in traditional religious circles, the goal is not to think, the goal is to obey. Don't say, the rabbis say, I don't want to do this. Don't say, I don't want to eat pork. Don't say, I don't want to sin in this way or in that way. Rather, say, I want to. But why don't I do it? Because the divine decreed it upon me. If the relationship in religion is a relationship of a king to the servant, a servant doesn't need their mind. A servant actually has to subdue their mind. Maimonides says, but how could you, conceptually, religiously, subdue that which God gave you, and by virtue of which you are who you are, and by virtue of which you have something in common with God? How could God, who is thus the God of reason, demand of you that which is not reasonable, and think that if you override and overcome your reason, you are somehow more religiously pious? That doesn't make sense by virtue of interpreting the notion created in the image of God is to be given a reason. And in 331, Maimonides translates 1:1 into a coherent doctrine, in which, in essence, I'll tell you what the point is, and then we'll look at it inside a few verses, where for Maimonides, religion is divine, not because you prove somehow its divine origin. Like somehow you remember for a while there was this codes, it was like all the rage. We're going to prove that the Bible is divine. Why? Because we're going to show all these secret codes that no mere human being could keep. And so if I could show you all these codes, letters, words that appear it's interesting, it preceded the Da Vinci Code, but it didn't just sort of scale the way that one did for some reason. But maybe our communities, but it was like, oh, I'm going to show you. You put a pin in and you'll find a letter, and then you go here, and then you multiply it by this X factor, and then divide it by this factor. Remember, I'm already lost because it's math, but I just sort of, and then, but they're going, and ups, and I'm there, and you see the word, it's God, what am I supposed to do? Amen. Right? That's it, it's God. God said it, perfect. I proved it. Somehow, if I could prove the miracle, then I know it's God. For Maimonides, the divinity of Scripture is not determined by some proof of its origin through some external form, but by its consistency with rationality. The more rational the text is, the more divine it is. Because remember, what did we get from God? God can't demand of us the irrational. To demand the irrational is to become less divine. I want to be more divine. Therefore, it has to be more reasonable. In other words, divinity, you are more committed to the divinity of Scripture, the more you find in it, It's modernity. Modernity is not the antithesis of religious life. The more the two could coexist, the more Scripture is divine. That's Maimonides' religious life. And that's the direct line from 1:1 to 3:25. And by the way, one of your goals in this course when you graduate Hartman is to be able to be in a world in which 1:1, 3:25 are a code. 1:1, But what about 3:32? We'll look at that in a moment. But we're first going to do 3:31. And you have to realize, it becomes, my bracha to you is that these, actually, I'm not joking, that, you see, in my father's life, each one of these chapters, it was like a piece of furniture in his house. It was like a picture. Like you grow up, 3:31. It's just like saying, you want to sit on the couch? What do you think of 3:31? In its relationship to 1:1, it's really interesting. 3:32, 3:51. This is the way you would, 2:25. These were all fixtures. Not fixtures, these were physical fixtures, which became part of a narrative, which guided you home. And home was the ability to build a rational Judaism. And 3:31, Maimonides says, there's a group of human beings who consider it a grievous thing that causes should be given for any law. What would please them most is that the intellect would not find a meaning for the commandments and prohibitions. They don't want it to make sense. But what compels them to feel thus, Maimonides says, is a sickness that they find in their souls. He was not a big pluralist. A sickness to which they were unable to give utterance, and of which they cannot furnish a satisfactory account. For they think that if those laws were useful in this existence, and had been given to us for this or that reason, it would have been as if they derived from the reflection and understanding of some intelligent being. We could have written it. If it's intelligent, I don't need God. I need God to tell me what I can't know. And therefore, religion, by definition, has to enter into the domain which transcends my rationality. And therefore, the more strange it is, the more bizarre it is, the more religious it is. Now, I don't mean to insult anybody, even though I will, so I'm going to say it and then I take it back. A lot of the fascination with Kabbalah is very similar. Somehow you feel you're in a religious realm because it's stuff that you frankly don't understand. And therefore, you feel that when you're in the domain that you don't understand, you're in the domain of the transcendent. For Maimonides, the transcendent was the domain that you understand. You're closest to God when you understand. If, however, there is a thing for which the intellect could not find any meaning at all, and that does not lead to something useful, it undoubtedly derives from God. Great. I need religion to tell me basically nonsense. This is what Maimonides says. If it's nonsense, that's what I need God for. And the act of religion is to embrace the nonsense as sensible on some level which transcends my rationality. Maimonides' religious impulse is the opposite. Skip down a few lines on the right-hand side, but he is far exalted above this. 5 or 6 lines. The contrary is the case. The whole purpose consisting in what is useful to us, as we have explained on the dictum, for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as it is this day. The more reasonable, the more defined. And for Maimonides, one of the interesting features about reason is that when something is reasonable, it doesn't have to be only within the context of your community. The reasonableness of Judaism, the intellectual authenticity of it, has to be self-evident also to somebody who's on the outside. Even the non-Jew who's looking, the idolater looking on the outside, is going to look at the Jewish people, keeping Torah. Maimonides says further down, it says, this is such a wise people, a wise and intelligent people. In other words, the intelligibility of Torah has to shout out at you. It has to shout out at you. And when it shout outs at you, now I know it came from God. I don't need codes. The content is what defines the divinity of it. And then, religiously, what happens? If we're created in the image of God, we and God get together around the rational. When we use that which defines us as human beings, our intelligence, and we remember that God is defined by that same principle, the place that we communicate is not in the Akedah where I subjugate my will to God. The place that we communicate, the place that we come together, is through a system which is rational. Then I and God could be in the room, which is in essence also, and many of you have been learning this is the essence of the living covenant. It's a living covenant because I, as a covenantal being, am present. And how am I present? Because the two of us are speaking a similar language, and nobody could play a power game over the other. We're both here. We meet as equals. And then we start a different journey with each other. This is the first foundation of this modern Jewish narrative. The second foundation, which is one of the most radical that Maimonides does, is that he changes the definition of Torah. Because it's one thing to say that Judaism is divine to the extent that it is rational. But what happens if the book is not simply good enough? What he does is he adds dimensions to the book. What constitutes Torah? And in his Mishnah Torah, in source 4, Hilchot Talmud Torah, Maimonides says, what's Torah? What does it mean to study Torah? What are the books that should fill up a Beit Midrash? You know, you're studying Daf Yomi, right? Who here heard of the category of Daf Yomi? Any here? A lot of you. Daf Yomi is the page of the day. How many pages there in Talmud? 1,700 or so, or whatever, 2,000. Takes about 2,500. Takes about 5 years to study every page, and you finish all of Talmud. Now, what should you be doing? What does it mean to study Torah? Well, for some people, it means studying Daf Yomi, and that's a great thing. I'm going to study a page, every day a page. Well, Maimonides tells you how you should be studying Torah. The time allotted to study should be divided into 3 parts, he said. A third should be devoted to the written law, a third to the oral law, and the last third should be spent in reflection, deducting conclusions from premises, developing implications and statements, comparing dicta, studying the hermeneutical principles by which the Torah is interpreted, till one knows the essence of these principles and how to deduce what is permitted and what is forbidden from what has learned traditionally. This is termed Talmud. So a third of your life, a third of your time, study Torah. A third of your time, study Mishnah. That's the core of the oral tradition. A third, study Talmud. Oh, great, I'm studying Daf Yomi. I'm studying Talmud. That's what I should be doing, right? For example, if one is an artisan who works at his trade 3 hours daily and devotes 9 hours of study to the study of Torah, which was what Maimonides believed the proper ratio should be, he should spend 3 of these 9 hours in the study of the written Torah, 3 in the study of the oral law, and the remaining 3 in reflecting how to deduce one from the other. The words of the prophets are comprised in the written law, while the exposition falls within the categories of oral law. The subjects, however, called pardes, now Maimonides goes into code. He goes into code. The subject, which is called pardes, are included in Talmud. Now, what that means, you don't know yet. It's code. So there's something which Maimonides now says, you remember what I told you about a third of your time studying Talmud? A third of your time you should be studying something called pardes. Now, is pardes Daf Yomi? We'll find out. He then says, this plan of a third, this applies to the period only when one begins learning, roughly till you're 8. But after one has become, proficient and no longer needs to really learn the written law, because once you read the stories, you sort of have it, or continually be occupied with the oral law, you get it down really quick. He should at times, what he should do at fixed times, read the written law, like on Mondays, Thursdays, and Shabbos morning, and the traditional dicta, so as not to forget any of the rules of Torah, and should devote all of his days exclusively to the study of Talmud, according to his breadth of mind and maturity of intellect. Study Talmud. That's really what you should be doing all the time. Great, I'm studying Daf Yomi. What? But remember this word pardes? What is pardes? In order to know what Maimonides thinks pardes is, you have to go to another section, which is also in code. And that's source 5. The topics of these first 4 chapters dealing with these 5 commandments, which is to know that there is a God, that he is the only God, that he is perfect unity, to love God and to fear God. And in these first 4 chapters, Maimonides basically is teaching metaphysics. He teaches the metaphysics of Judaism. These were called by our ancient sages pardes. So I'm sure you could read this many times and go home and say, okay, this is interesting, not so interesting. What you just read is one of the most revolutionary moves ever made by any Jewish philosopher in Jewish history. And what is this move? What is Talmud for Maimonides? Talmud for Maimonides is not Daf Yomi. Talmud at its core is Pardes. What is Pardes? The study of philosophy and metaphysics and philosophy, physics, and metaphysics. That's Talmud. What is Maimonides' second stage? If the first move is to recognize that you worship God through a shared intellectual agenda, the second move is to redefine what constitutes Torah. And Torah is not just the Talmud that you know. Torah is to include anything that I believe a rational human, intelligent human being should know. That's Talmud. And for Maimonides, when I study physics or metaphysics, I'm studying what? Judaism. I'm studying Torah. Here, we're not going to read this. Write down for yourself another code, 351. Write it down. Go home and read 351 of the guide. And Maimonides tells you, those people who study Daf Yomi, God is in the castle, Maimonides says. And everybody wants to get to the castle, and everybody wants to see God. If you're studying Daf Yomi, he says, like many of the rabbis, you could be walking and looking, you'll never even get to the castle. You'll never get to the castle. You will never come in the presence of God. All your Daf Yomis, all the pages added on top of each other, aren't going to get you there. What's going to get you there is the study of physics and metaphysics and philosophy. And therefore, the study of Talmud, the study of Torah now, expands way beyond what's written. And now, through his commitment to reason, anything that adds reason to a life is the way that you worship God. Anything that adds depth and intelligence to a life is a part of Torah. And the mitzvah of the study of Torah is fulfilled not just by opening up the book of Genesis, but by opening up physics, biology, and metaphysics. Now, what makes this, for my father, this chapter, this, Talmud Torah 1:11, and Maimonides Hilchot Yesodei Torah in general, were absolutely gold. Why? What's the other layer that I have to unpack? The first sources I read were from where? The Guide for the Perplexed. The second sources I read were from where? The Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah is Maimonides' codification of Jewish law. Now, prior to my father's thesis, the basic premise when people came to study Maimonides is that, you remember how I said modern Jew, you can be schizophrenic? Their claim was that Maimonides is basically schizophrenic. There are two Maimonides. There's the Maimonides, the philosopher, and there's the Maimonides, the halachic thinker. And people claim, sure, Maimonides was revolutionary in the Guide for the Perplexed. But you don't have to read for the Guide for the Perplexed, because the guide is not what? Try it. What's the guide not? Torah. Guide's not even Torah. Maimonides wrote it, but who said that everything that Maimonides writes is Torah? It's not Torah. Forget about it. You go to yeshivas all over the world, you won't find a Guide for the Perplexed in the Beis Medrash. It doesn't exist. You don't need to read it. That's where Maimonides went to sin. And when he came home to halacha, he was a good yeshiva boy like everybody else. Maimonides doesn't touch halacha. So how are you a modern Jew? A modern Jew means think whatever you want, but do exactly what Judaism tells you to do. I'm not asking you to have a lobotomy. No, knock yourself out with your mind. Follow it, love it, play with it, do anything you want with it. But when it comes to the doing, then just recognize that your mind has to be left outside the room, to be reactivated the minute you finish davening. When you leave shul, when you leave your kitchen. When my father saw these, he realized that Judaism could be alive for him. Because what these sources proved to him is that Maimonides was not schizophrenic. There was one Maimonides. And the same philosophical principles that say that if I'm creating an image of God means that I am given a reason. And if I'm given a reason, I worship God precisely through the utilization of that reason, gets translated in Maimonides' halacha into a redefinition of what constitutes Talmud Torah. Now, Torah and philosophy could be one. And I could be a modern Jew. Because I'm not limited only by what's written. I am guided by what I know. And if I as a human being, and here I'm now going to transcend Maimonides for a moment, and if I as a human being encounter and enter into the 20th and 21st century, and I discover gender equality, and I know gender equality, and I discover that people may have different sexual orientations, and I know that the categories of abomination don't work, and I know that principles of democracy are more significant than the principles of monarchy, and I know about inalienable rights of human beings, and I know that people should not be distinguished on the basis of race, gender, nationality, religious commitments. These are things that I now know. From Maimonides, this study, you don't even get into the moment of the schizophrenic existence because the things that you know become Torah. And that Judaism survives to the extent, not simply that it integrates and how does it answer, but precisely because we make them part of what we are as Jews. I don't live two different worlds. If there's a truth that I know, that's my Judaism. And then here Maimonides says, forget it. I don't even go to interpretation yet. We're going to come to that in a moment. I don't even go there yet. Before I even go there, I've redefined Judaism. And Maimonides loves the tradition and spends all of his life studying Torah, which for him is the study of physics and metaphysics. And he loves Judaism because it is the religion that he believes makes this most possible, and he knows that the only people who will ever get to see the king, who will see the castle in 351, are the people who transcend Daf Yomi and have a new idea of what Talmud Torah is about. And this Maimonides doesn't say in his ivory tower of philosophy. This he says where? In his Mishnah Torah, in his codification of Jewish law. There are other examples, but we don't have the time to look at them. One of the most important for yourself to look at homework is that not only does he redefine Torah, he also redefines our heroes. And the hero, Abraham, who basically, the verse of Lech Lecha is, I will make a commitment to you forever if you are an individual who is willing to go to the land that I will show you without question. If you are an individual who's willing to be tested by me time after time after time, after being burnt and after being disappointed by human beings who rejected God every single moment, God says, I'm not going to do this anymore. I want to find a human being who I say, go forth from your father's home, leave your past, leave your roots, and go to the land that I will show you simply because I told you to go. And if you go, You're listening to me. And I'm going to tell you, you know what? You're going to have children as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand in the seashore. And you don't even have a kid. And you don't check out. You're still going with me, guys. This is someone to have a relationship with. Do you remember that movie? There was this movie about some kid growing up, I think in Brooklyn, where he befriended a gangster. And the guy said, how do I know if this woman I'm dating is a keeper? And I remember this line. It was such a great line. He says, when you go and you open the door for her, and she sits down, if by the time you get to your side, she reaches over and opens up the door for you, he says, that's a keeper. What? Bronx? Bronx Tale. Bronx Tale. I read that. That's a keeper. God says, if somebody is going to stay faithful to me, when I keep on telling him how numerous his people is going to be, and he doesn't even have one kid, this is a keeper. This is a keeper. This is someone serious. And you know what? Even more than that. After his whole life, I finally give him a kid. And I kept on promising him, you know what? I'm going to make of you a great nation, and all the nations of the world are going to bless themselves by you, and you don't even have a single kid. And then finally, when I give you a kid, I say, give him back, and you're willing to do so. This is somebody, I got to tell you, I'm staying with this guy. That's the Bible. Maimonides retells that whole story. And in Hilchot Avodah Zarah, source 1:3, please read that on your own. And what Maimonides basically retells is he turns Abraham into a philosopher just like him. And the journey of Abraham is not the journey which follows the incomprehensible commandment of God. Abraham's journey is a journey of acquiring knowledge of God. And he creates this notion at the end, who are the descendants of Abraham? In Genesis, the descendants of Abraham are the seed of Abraham. According to Maimonides, the descendants of Abraham are a people who know God. Rewrites the whole story. He adds, in other words, forget the chapters that I don't like. He adds new chapters into the book. And so all of a sudden, how could I live as a modern Jew? Because Judaism is expanded and transformed by that which I know. But when all is said and done, you can add a lot of things to Judaism. You're still stuck with chapters that are stupid. So you could say that to be Jewish means to live with a God who expresses God's self through the rational, and who the ultimate religious life is to be at one with God in the rational. That's fine. But what do I do with these chapters? What do I do with them? Okay, so I could tell you don't study Daf Yomi, study physics and metaphysics, but part of Talmud is still what? Talmud. It's still Talmud. What do I do with all this stuff in there? That I know that not only do the nations of the world not look at and say, wow, this is phenomenal. Knock yourselves out. Open up Leviticus, Tazria, and Mitzorah and show it to your favorite Christian or Muslim and ask them, do you think this is a phenomenally interesting text? The one about the blotches on the wall. See how impressive people find that one. Does this really move them? So I could, don't look at that. So, that's how very often what happens, in Jewish, Christian, Muslim dialogue. Each one of us finds the one verse that we think is nice, and that's what we spend 14 conferences on, looking at all, oh yes, my tradition loves peace, no, my tradition loves peace, no, my tradition loves peace, and we all cherry pick. We pick the verse that loves peace. We all love peace, we hug and we go home. Well, it's, what? You think this is what we do. This is Jewish, Christian, Muslim dialogue. And sometimes we even have international conferences with press. And maybe we'll go to the Vatican and we'll all declare our shared... What about all the other crap? What do you do with that crap? And it's there. So I don't have to spend all my time on it. Maimonides says, do you know what? If we get you to study the crap when you're young, then when you're old, you could study the other stuff, but it's there. Maimonides adds a number of other revolutionary moves to enable him to be a modern Jew. And I want to look at them, and then I want to end with the difficult question that Maimonides faces. The first thing that Maimonides does is he creates a very theologically simple but revolutionary idea. And that idea is that a perfect God cannot give a perfect Torah to an imperfect people. When people come to look at tradition, they very often ask, if God wrote the book, let it reflect who God is. Maimonides says you have to do a switch, because the relevant point can't simply be who the author is, but who what? Who the audience is. Maimonides basically says in source 9, and I'm giving you a lot of homework. Maimonides basically says in source 9 that much of the Bible is a children's book. It's a children's book. Dr. Seuss might actually have even been a doctor. He might have even been a doctor. I don't know if he was or he wasn't. He might have known nuclear physics. But he wanted to teach us about the Cat in the Hat. He was writing to children. Maimonides says you have to understand that one of the secrets of being a modern Jew is to understand that part of the Bible is a children's book. And at different stages in people's lives, people could hear different things. And God, in the second paragraph on page 11, after telling a story about a child who starts learning Torah because they want a candy, and afterwards they study Torah because they want a mark, and afterwards they study Torah because they want money, and afterwards they study Torah because they want fame, and at no point study Torah because of what's in it, but because they think that it's the candy, the money, the fame, the marks. They think that's the point. Maimonides says, what am I supposed to do? All of this is deplorable, he says. However, it is unavoidable because of man's limited insight, as a result of which he makes the goal of wisdom something other than wisdom itself. And all the rewards and punishments in the Bible, all those chapters, what do you want from me? It's a children's book. Why? Why does the Bible have to be a children's book? The answer is because people are children. And if I don't talk to people the way they are, the fundamental principle of religion is that it is not just pure reason and philosophy, it's applied thought which takes into account the reality of where people are. And if you don't do so, religion becomes irrelevant. And religion never wants to be irrelevant. So after expanding what Torah is, Maimonides says, but we also now have to go into those chapters. Part of Torah is a children's book. That's one principle. And I have to do it. Because if that's who they are, I have to speak to them. And that's why I have to tell them that you should keep the Torah because you're going to get this reward or that reward. The truth, God says, this is embarrassing for me. It's embarrassing for me to have to threaten you. It's embarrassing for me to tell you you're going to have the death penalty. All that stuff, it's just, what am I supposed to do? That's what you needed to hear. Because otherwise you wouldn't hear. A. B. 332. Not only is there stuff that this is a children's book, because people are children. A perfect God cannot give a perfect Torah to an imperfect people, but a perfect God can also not give a perfect Torah to a people embedded within a particular historical context. if they weren't childish, even if we were the most developed people of our time, we were still what? 13th century BCE people. In 13th century BCE, if I was a farmer, and I'm living in the Middle East, and there's a drought, I need rain. What am I going to do if I need rain? I know I need somebody to help bring me rain. I have to turn to that God. If I'm going to turn to that God with any hope for rain, I got to give God a goat. If I don't give God a goat, I'm not going to get rain. And I feel that somehow if I give God a more expensive goat, and after a goat I give him a cow, and that cow is unblemished, and I really do this whole thing, then I'm going to get rain. Because I grow up in an idolatrous world, that that's the way you get rain. Now, if I would say to you, do you know what? Forget the goats. When you think God doesn't know that you need rain, contemplate inside your wishes. Maybe pray to the God who created the world. Say a few words. What are you, crazy? I need rain. This is not an exercise, in some spiritual, existential renewal. I'm not looking to sing Kumbaya and to feel good about myself. I need rain. There's a difference. Yoga is really important for the wholeness of self. But at this moment, I'm not looking for the wholeness of self. I'm looking for what? Rain. Rain, I need a goat. Sounds strange? That would not sound strange to you if you just came out of Egypt. And Maimonides says in 332, and you need to remember this, half of Torah, over half of the 613 commandments of Torah pertain to sacrifices. And Maimonides uses as follows. He says, in antiquity, that's all they knew. And about 12 lines from the bottom, therefore he may be exalted on page 17. Therefore he may be exalted, suffered the above mentioned kind of worship to remain. Suffers it. He allows it. Torah, it could be both a child's book, and two, because people will sometimes be childish, and I, as the philosopher, I, as the person who knows, has to know that not everybody knows what I know. And if religion's going to work, it's not just going to speak to me, it's going to have to speak to everybody. And a lot of people are going to need some threats. Without a little bit of threats, that's a great motivation. If there is no fear, people aren't going to do the good. Because the big problem that people have is not knowing the good, it's doing the good. And therefore, a little fear goes a long way. I wish I didn't have to speak that way, but what could I do? I have to speak that way. And Maimonides says, but not only childish. Torah is a historically grounded document. To think that the perfection of God could create a text that transcends time is ludicrous, Maimonides says. Because then I couldn't be speaking to a particular people at a particular time. I have to suffer stuff in order for Torah to work. And in each generation, Torah has to speak to its particular generation. So what's the narrative? Stage one, the intellect is that which we share with God. And that's what makes us human. And therefore, to religiously demand the transcendence of the intellect is nonsensical. It's just nonsensical. It's to ask us not to be human. Two, that is precisely the place where we and God get together. And something is more divine to the extent that it is more reasonable. Two. Three, this embracing of reason demands of us that we add to Torah. We add to Torah what constitutes the core essence of Torah. And that any good idea, like we're shoppers. Modernity's not scary for us. The minute we hear a new idea, I want it. It's like, I don't feel, oh, what am I going to do? The opposite. If it's a new idea, come on in. if it's something that I find intellectually compelling and sick, that's Judaism. I don't feel like, why don't we say it first? I don't forget about it. Bring it in. And make that study Torah. Make that the study of Torah. Redefine your heroes. Redefine even Maimonides in Hilchot Shuvah. What does it mean to get to receive a place in the world to come? Your place and status in the world to come, according to Maimonides, is determined by the knowledge that you acquire. The more knowledge you acquire, the greater place you have in the world to come. Redefines the whole system. And he makes room for a whole new intellectual enterprise which grows out of reason. And as a result, ends up into Torah, because the God who is the God of intellect and reason is the residue in which all good ideas come home. What a different story of Judaism. Now what do I do with the stupid stuff? The stupid stuff, Maimonides says, I have to recognize that stupid stuff doesn't mean that God is stupid. This is the core point. The stupid stuff doesn't mean that God's stupid, and the stupid stuff doesn't mean that Judaism is stupid. It simply means that God was a good educator. And what you teach in grade 1 is not what you teach in grade 12. And we have to speak to different people who coexist in time. And we also had to speak to different people in different times. And therefore, what Maimonides did, God is not stupid. Now, what do you do? Now, the big question that I'd like to put on the table, and I want to just show you how Maimonides deals with this very briefly. So what are the limits? Is there any Judaism? So we started out by saying, can there be a modern Judaism? The question is there any Judaism left? Or is Judaism now synonymous with modernity? If to worship God is to worship God through reason, great. I'll find what that is. I'll worship God on the altar of democracy. I'll worship God on the altar of contemporary ethics, which are superior to ancient ethics, and life's fine. Where's the Judaism? Are there any boundaries? Are there any limits? Is there something you can't do? Maimonides gives us two answers. The first answer Maimonides gives us in source 11. Do you understand the question? There's no schizophrenia because life's simple. There is no Judaism. I don't have to study. I just have to study philosophy now. I don't have to go study Talmud. Maimonides says as follows. The King Messiah will arise and restore the kingdom of David from its former state and original sovereignty. Now he's talking about the end of days. He will rebuild the sanctuary and gather the dispersed of Israel. All the ancient laws will be reinstituted in his days. Sacrifices will again be offered. The sabbatical and jubilee year will again be observed in accordance with the commandments set forth in the law. This source poses a major problem for my father. What's going on here? Is Maimonides against? One second, you just said that God suffers sacrifices even though they're stupid because the people at the time needed to give God a goat. But why are you bringing the goat back when? In the end of times, when Maimonides, am in the middle, already know that a goat is stupid. I don't want, does anybody here want temple sacrifices? It's going to smell. It stinks. Why do you think they had incense? It stunk. How many of you walk near cows and feel that it's a spiritual experience? I mean it, it's not, it's disgusting. Ugh. This is what Maimonides says, when we're finally there, we got the goats again. So many people say, Dovi, see, you're wrong. Okay, I can't explain Hilchot Talmud Torah. I can't explain why he starts his Mishnah Torah with an exposition of philosophy, physics, and metaphysics. But at the end of the day, look, Maimonides, he comes home, and his mind he leaves where? In his guide and in his Mishnah Torah, he's still a yeshiva boy who's really happy with what a goat. And whether he thinks it's stupid or not, at the end of the day, once Torah says give a goat, what do you got to do? You got to give a goat. You can't change halacha. So I remember we spent, Bernie, because every time I speak about my father teaching and Bernie's in the room, it's like, I can't think about my father. Bernie was just such a staple of my father's teaching for just decades. And we spent so many years in university together in my father's classes. And I remember we would talk about this was like for years, because how you interpret this verse, this chapter, will depend on whether my father's, does it work or not work? Or is Maimonides schizophrenic even a deeper way, because part of him brings his Mishnah, his guide into the text, and part of him doesn't. So it's like, is it a whole big mission, then you can do anything you want with it? My father used to answer that the reason why Maimonides believes that sacrifices will remain is because he believed that the temptation for idolatry was eternal. That the particular temptation for idolatry wasn't grounded simply in the idolatrous experience of antiquity, but it's embedded in the human condition. We all need idols, and therefore we're always going to need goats. And if we got a goat, somehow it's going to feel that we speak to God in a deeper way. I used to argue with him about this all the time. And I think on this he was wrong. He didn't think he was wrong, and he thought I was wrong, but that's okay. That was part of the fun of learning together. I think there's another answer here. I think Maimonides knew that in his time, sacrifices would already be unnecessary. And he even hints to it in 332, which you're going to read really carefully when you go home. When he says, if I would have gotten rid of sacrifices, it's as if in our time we told people not to pray and just to contemplate. And Maimonides clearly speaks about a progression of a people who've now psychologically replaced sacrifices with Tehillim. And we feel good with Tehillim. If somebody's sick, say Tehillim. Tehillim has that, we're in a verbal stage. We don't need sacrifices. I think Maimonides here is pushing to a different approach to what it means to be a modern Jew. Maimonides is saying, I could keep sacrifices, and I could offer goats. My biggest problem that I'm trying for me to be a modern Jew is I have to know, is God stupid? If God's stupid, I can't be Jewish. I can't be Jewish. I can't respect this tradition. If it's nonsensical, if it's just silly, I can't be a part of this tradition. But if I know why this commandment was given, even if the fulfillment of this commandment is not personally compelling, I could fulfill it so long as it doesn't undermine my agenda of living a modern Judaism. Now, there are places, as we're going to see in a moment, if you'll just turn back to source 2, there are places where Maimonides says, I can't. 225, Maimonides says, know that are shunning the affirmation of the eternity of the world, on page 2. The fact that we don't accept Aristotelian doctrine that the world is eternal is not due to the fact that the text in the Torah says that the world has been produced in time. I don't reject Aristotelian notion of the eternality of the world because the Torah says that the world was created. One second, why wouldn't you? If Genesis 1 says, in the beginning when God created the world, Aristotle says God can't create the world. As a Jew, what should I accept? Should you accept Torah? Should you accept Aristotle? And Maimonides says, the reason why I reject Aristotle is not because it's written in the Torah. What are you talking about? That's the only reason. It's written in Torah. No. That's not my Torah. For the text, he says, indicating that the world had been produced in time are not more numerous than those indicating that the deity is a body. So the Bible says that God created the world. Big deal. The Bible also says that God had a body. And I got around the second one. I could get around anything. Nor are the gates, listen carefully, and underline it, and circle it, and circle it, and circle it. Nor are the gates of figurative interpretation shut in our faces or impossible of access to us regarding the subject of the creation of the world and time. The gates of interpretation lead me, I could do anything I wanted to. When I hear an idea and I'm confronted with a text, I could fix the text. I could say the text was figurative. I could say you don't know what it means. I could interpret it, and the gates of interpretation are limitless. I could do with the text anything I want to do with it. But, he says, two causes in the next paragraph are responsible for us not doing this. The first is that the fact that the deity is not a body has been demonstrated. I know that God doesn't have a body. And the minute I know that God doesn't have a body, I can't keep on the books that which I think is intellectually wrong. But the fact that the world wasn't created hasn't been proven. So Aristotle, his argument that the world is eternal is not something that I have to believe in. And when I have scripture versus opinion, I don't change Torah. Here you have what is Maimonides' modern Judaism. When modernity gives me something that I know, the gates of interpretation are open and I will always change scripture. But not everything that I know. There are times that I don't know. There are times that there are two plausible things. When there are two plausible things, what will I always pick, Maimonides says? That plausible position which is coexistent with what's written. I don't just change for change's sake. I will only change to the extent that it is something that I know. Because God can't be stupid. Sacrifices, the minute I'm able to give it an so I offered sacrifices. Unless you're a vegetarian and you believe that this is a moral issue, fair enough. I'm going to exclude that for a moment. But for all of you who are the pcha eaters in the room, the pcha eaters in the room aren't going to be profoundly morally struggling with the reality of sacrifices. So it's not the way I spiritually relate. But I don't change something unless I am morally and intellectually compelled to do so. What I am compelled to do is to save God from stupidity. The purpose of a historical contextual interpretation is not to change halacha, but very often to free me from having to change halacha. Did you understand that? Should I say that again? Okay. The purpose of a historical contextualization of halacha is not to free me from having to keep it, but it's actually to allow me to keep it. Because when I give it a historical context, so long as it doesn't violate a truth, most things are neutral. Most things are neutral. Does starting Shabbos when the sun sets more rational than starting it when you get home? In other words, when I approach halacha as a modern Jew, Maimonides says, I only change if it is something that there's a proof. A proof text has been given that this is true. If Torah contradicts the truth, then the gates of figurative interpretation are open, and I will always change it. And that's why God doesn't have a body, and that's why Torah has to include philosophy, because I know you can't come closer to God unless you study physics and metaphysics. I know that you only become truly human to the extent that you embrace knowledge as knowledge. I'm going to do everything. But I can give you a goat. And giving you a goat doesn't harm me so long as I know that God doesn't need a goat. It's only when I think that God needs a goat that I've made God stupid. But the minute I say, it's in there. Historical context frees you. That's right. Why do you do it? What does it mean to be a modern Jew? To be a modern Jew means to be committed to tradition, even if you don't necessarily feel inspired by it, so long as it doesn't undermine The notion that this is an intelligent tradition. And one of the ways that you save it is through the notion of historical context. At the same time, Maimonides offers another explanation. And this is in the last source that I gave you, on page 25. It is permitted, according to Jewish law, to work a heathen slave with rigor. You're basically allowed to, you remember the word, you're allowed to treat your idolatrous slaves the way Pharaoh treated us in Egypt. And you remember it says, you shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt? That's Leviticus 19. Somehow the message of Leviticus 19 didn't make it to Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25 is a different Judaism than Leviticus 19. How? That's a subject for another conversation. The fact is simply that that is true. Treat your idolatrous slaves the way Pharaoh treated you. Now Maimonides says that's the law. There's nothing I could do. That's what Leviticus 25 says. But though such is the rule, Maimonides says, it is the quality of piety and the way of wisdom that a man be merciful and pursue justice. Maimonides argues that there is a category of wisdom and piety that aren't expressed in Torah. If I know something to be false, I will reinterpret it. When I know it to be morally inferior, I will either reinterpret it or I will create another level of Torah. There are two additions to Daf Yomi. You understand when I mention Daf Yomi what I'm referring to, like the simple classic Talmud. The first addition to Torah is the new knowledge that we acquire as human beings. The second addition to Torah is the new moral standards that we acquire as human beings. And Torah becomes the bare minimum. It doesn't reflect all that we ought to be. And so I have another layer of moral responsibility that sits over and above Torah. Now all of these are what I'm committed to. So long as, and now turn back to 225 on page 2, and with that we'll conclude. There's something else that guides me, Maimonides says. There's another reason why I rejected Aristotle's notion of the eternity of the world. Because if I accept Aristotle's notion that the world is eternal, according to Aristotle, God can't create a world because the God who is perfect can't be involved in the physical universe. To be involved in the physical would be an act of imperfection. A perfect God cannot be cognizant of, let alone be involved in the corporal physical world. If God is cognizant of you, that means God's mind is filled with junk. And for God to be God, God has to be ignorant of you. And therefore the world can never be created. But if the world can never be created, that means God isn't involved in history. That, he says, is a problem. Creation, first 2 chapters of Genesis, I can get rid of that like in 15 seconds. 15 seconds. It's not what happened, it's an image. That's a problem. What I want you to do is I want you to have the belief that the world was created, because the belief that the world was created involves idea A, B, C, and D, even though the world was never created. Done, it's gone. Our belief that the deity is not a body destroys for us none of the foundations of the law. When I change that, Torah is safe. You could be a great Jew without believing that when God says that I was angry, God lifts his hand, that it wouldn't really mean that God's a right-handed person. And does not give lie to the claims of any of the prophets. The only objection to it is constituted by the fact that the ignorant think that this belief is contrary to the text. There's literal readers of the text, and they feel you have to be a literalist. Yet it is not contrary to it, as we have explained, etc. On the other hand, The belief in eternity, the way Aristotle sees it, that is the belief according to which the world exists in virtue of necessity, that no nature changes at all, and that the customary course of events cannot be modified with regard to anything. It destroys the law in its principle, necessarily gives lie to every miracle, and reduces to inanity all the hopes and threads that the law has held out. Maimonides wants a modern Judaism. He will add to Judaism anything that he feels is intellectually compelling. He will add to Judaism anything that he feels is morally compelling. He will reinterpret Judaism so that the new morality sits above and the other one is like the bare minimum if. Where you really should be is beyond. You should be walking the path of piety and the way of wisdom, and your morality has to go way beyond Torah. Your Talmud has to go way beyond Talmud. If it contradicts knowledge, I'll reinterpret it. But I will keep something if tradition says it, if my keeping it doesn't demand of me the sacrifice of my mind. And if it's just neutral, I'll keep it, because the power of tradition is that tradition is not tradition if you could change it all the time. It loses its weight. Tradition is tradition only to the extent that it demands that of you. And Maimonides says, I will keep sacrifices simply because I know that God's not stupid. Once I've saved God, I can keep it. More than that, when I come to change things or not to change things, I also ask, what's the significance for the larger system? To be a modern Jew is not to be schizophrenic, but to be a modern Jew is to live with a commitment to modernity, but also a commitment to tradition. And to sometimes, it's a dance. It's not a schizophrenic dance because I'm not asking you ever to sacrifice your modernity, but at the same time, I'm asking you not to sacrifice your Judaism and your tradition when you don't need to do so. When it's a moral notion, when it's a moral category, you have to do so. If it's immoral, build it. If Torah is too narrow, add to it. But other than that, tradition compels you. Torah is not Torah unless it compels you. How you dance between the two is what it means to be a modern Jew. And the dance between the two is in essence the dance that my father tried to teach in this book. He tried to teach in the Living Covenant. And in many ways, all of you who know him well know that the story of his life was exactly that dance. How do you balance? And there isn't a right and a wrong answer. There's not an Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Renewal, Post-denominational. It's not a denominational issue. And therefore, it's not a right or wrong answer. It's a constant struggle. Have I changed something that I didn't need to change? Or have I sacrificed my moral standards at a moment that I didn't have to sacrifice them? You have two loves and two commitments. And you're hunted and obligated by both. And a modern Jewish life is somehow to try to find a way. You never resolve it, but to live with those tensions, to hear them, to be obligated by them, and to find some path to walk between them. Thank you. Now we have some time. We started 10 minutes late. We have 15 minutes for questions. Anybody have, let me just see the hands. Okay, so what we're going to do is instead of me answering each one, because you ask short questions and I answer long answers, I'm going to take down all, and like 4 or 5, and then I'll answer. So we'll start with this side, and then we'll come to this side. Yes, please.
So speaking as a Jewish educator, the challenge for me is that we often have kids who leave Jewish education just at the point where they've heard the stupid stories and haven't yet gotten to the point where they realize that there's more beyond that. And so the challenge for us is how to either entice them or teach them this kind of a message in a way that can keep them
great comment and question. Yes, please. Yes.
Does God intervene in history according to Maimonides? Does he take the story of Mitzrayim literally or metaphorically?
Good questions. Yes, please.
Is the world in the Jewish philosophy, is the world eternal or is it not eternal?
Got it. Next. Yes, please.
God is not corporeal. Why does it not bother you that God has an intellect? Why does it not bother you that God has an intellect?
Maimonides knew that he didn't have a good answer to that one. Yes, yes, please. No, you're absolutely right. I'll tell you what he means by yes, please.
The 13 principles of Maimonides, especially when about resurrection of the dead.
Oh, this is a very knowledgeable audience. You know that what I'm going to do is I'm doing these. Just the quality of these questions is putting a lot of pressure on this side. Just so you should know, we're going to watch these and then we're going to come down. What about? Just 1 second. Very, 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 very good questions. Yes, please.
Fundamentally important to Maimonides to overcome the notion of the corporeality of God. Is there not a necessary connection between animal sacrifice and the corporeality of God?
I'm going to come, what I'll do is I'm going to answer these, so hold your hand, or I'm going to attempt to, yes, last two, yes, please?
How does prayer fit into this, which is a relatively fixed form of love?
Yes, please?
In my reading of 351, which is really my reading of Rambam as a whole, there's something that I didn't hear in the opposition you set up between reason and revelation, which is a form of insight and illumination.
I'm sorry, a little louder?
But it's not only that God only won't get us to the castle, but that ultimately that human reason won't get us all the way to the castle either, and that there's a form of illumination and insight that exceeds both revealed tradition and human cogitation. And I'm wondering what you think of that, whether you read that in Rambam as well, that there's a form of prophecy and imaginative faculty beyond both Torah and revealed tradition. And
Good. Thank you. Okay, we got this side. I'm going to have enough, I promise. Now we're going to come to all of you in a moment and just rethink your questions, see if you can come up with better ones. Okay. You're right. We shoot ourselves in the foot all the time. We have instituted stupid, childish Judaism. And then we turn around and wonder why we're having a problem perpetuating our tradition. When we don't create enough frameworks for our children to actually to communicate a Judaism that they could live with for the rest of their life. The notion that if you have a child in kindergarten, the Catholic notion, give me a kid when they're 5 and I'll have them for lifetime, is an antiquated notion for a time when tradition and community were compelling. It's a completely irrelevant category in a modern universe of discourse that we live in. And unless we find significant avenues to communicate to our children, more than some experiential something when they're college students, but to be able to go beyond, we don't have a chance. Now our institutions have to think what we need to do. And how do we do that? We're very smart people, but we're not acting that smart. And your question is a very smart one. Now, how do we respond? And how do we create programs for kids at later ages where parents, where the notion that I bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah my kid and therefore I'm done, which is instituted and built into the tradition, is basically building a necessary failure into our conversation. Does Maimonides believe that God intervenes in history? Probably not. And here, the subtle answer is that 225 is that he believes that we have to allow Torah to allow for miracles because people need miracles. So he's even committed to allowing certain principles in the tradition that he doesn't need, but that he knows other people need. In other words, Torah has to be educationally sound. And therefore, you can come up with a Torah that makes such perfect sense that no one's going to want to follow and listen. And the myth of God intervention in history is critical for Maimonides. For Maimonides, miracle, every time there was a miracle, for him, miracles are basically embedded within nature. This break within history, for him, is irrational. He doesn't need it. And therefore he says that my God, Moses walking up Mount Sinai is Moses walking up the mountain of knowledge. What that means, I'll allow all of you heretics to figure out later. But you understand what I mean. And so what he's saying in 225 as a result of your question is even more radical. I will even keep certain things on the book because I know that's what people need to hear. Because without it, the whole system falls apart. And part of being a Jew is not only living for yourself, but recognizing that this whole people needs a Judaism, and therefore what are the things that you're going to keep that you know that someone else needs? Even if you yourself know that maybe I can get away without doing that. Is the world created according to, yes. Maimonides believes that the world was created. He doesn't believe that the eternality of the world is an intellectually necessary or compelling doctrine. And the notion of whether it was created 5,700 and something years ago or 4 gazillion years ago, Jews always found to be a boring question. That Christian question never interested Jews. We had no problem. Just like we were able to interpret that God doesn't have a body, we were able to interpret that every day is a billion years. And Jews don't get overly excited about proving that the Big Bang fits in with the creation story, because we didn't read the creation story as a literal story. But the fact that God created the world is something that Maimonides did believe in. If God's not corporal, what about the God's mind? There you got Maimonides, and he knows it, and therefore he says, he spends a lot of the first part of the guy saying, it's that which defines us, and it's what we would, and he speaks of that God has and doesn't have an intellect, but God acts in such a way which we would attribute to something having an intellect. And he tries to deal with the negative. He tries to hide behind negative attributes, where it's not that we could say that God has an intellect, but we know that God does not have an intellect. And so he tries to get around it, but your point is you know, he knows he has to tell a whole story about it, and you're right, and it's...
Will you give me 5 minutes sometime?
Yes, I will be happily to. If God is, what about the 13 principles, including the resurrection of the dead? Maimonides did not believe in his 13 principles. Many of his 13 principles were similar. You have to remember, Maimonides, if God writes a Torah for children, Maimonides realizes that he also has to write a Torah for children. And some of his Torah is for the Jewish people, not just for him. He couldn't believe that the resurrection of the dead was possible because for him the world to come was when you transcended your body. To transcend your body is to be in the highest form of being, when you're a pure intellect. Consequently, to be returned to your body would have been a punishment instead of a reward for Maimonides. Next, 6. This is all short. Is there a connection between animal sacrifice and corporeality? Without doubt. Of course, God's hungry. You know, that's the whole God. Why are you giving a goat? You know, you're giving a goat to feed somebody who wants a goat. So of course, that's also part of it. Part of the sacrificial system is also you feel safer if you gave something of money, like you paid your dues. It's like, you know, it's like if I had an expensive seat on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, you know what I mean? Then it's like my chances of you know, it's like it has to do both with the corporality of God and also the notion of personal sacrifice. Next, how does prayer fit into Maimonides? That's a huge. Suffice it to say that Maimonides believes that prayer is also a temporary form of worship, and that the ideal form of worship is contemplation. He says that in 332. As to the last question, does it go beyond reason? It's a great question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. There is what reason takes you, reason is all of it, but then there's this like last little step. But that last little step is out of your hands. But this is what gets you almost there. But so that would be, okay, good luck. Yes, please. Yes, we're just going to do these the same system, okay? Everybody feel more or less? And we can talk, good. We're going to go from left to right. Yes, please, sir.
Aristotle thought that truth was built into us, that things were self-evident, both physical and moral truths. We now know that physical truths aren't self-evident. We test them by the scientific method. How do we test our moral truths in the modern world?
Great question. Next. Excellent. Yes, please, ma'am.
I don't understand why either Maimonides or your father draw such a polar distinction between new moral values and the tradition, when there isn't much in the way of ethics that can't be derived from love your neighbor as yourself, love the stranger as yourself, and
Good question. Excellent, thank you. Why draw?
so you can just emphasize a different part of it.
I'm with you. I got you. Good, excellent question. Yes, please.
And then to end on a very non-deep note, this is just a linguistic question. The principles of Pardes, is the use of the term Pardes supposed to evoke on Aiden?
Yes, what is Pardes? Good. I'll explain. It's a good question. Thank you. Yes, please.
You ended on the note that it's our dance to morally subtract and add to make God not stupid. So my question is, if we're morally subtracting and adding, why this?
Good.
Like it could be many things, other things.
Good, 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 good. Very good. Yes, please. 1, 2, 3, and then we'll conclude. Yes.
The modernity abuts against tradition. Do the changes that one makes be personal, or do they always have to be communal?
That's the hardest question. Yes, please.
Yeah, one of my Maimonides saved somebody who only got 1050 on the SAT. How would you regard him?
Good. Last question.
Yeah, I assume that Maimonides wrote his Mishnah Torah before he converted to Islam. In your father's book, with regard to the Aguna, he specifically quotes a passage from Maimonides, which is identical almost word for word in the translation of Surah 832, possession of women. That seemed to be something that bothered your father tremendously. How do you feel about that particular issue, as it was a main issue of his last book?
Okay, good. Did I have this whole? We got it? Good. Okay. What?
Was it a good sign?
That's for you to judge. You did good. You did good. But you didn't ask a question, so you could benefit from either side. You know, you could like just move over here if you want to. Number one, if truth was built in, is it self-evident? How do we test our moral truths? We don't. We really don't. And while Maimonides did believe that on certain issues there were scientific proofs, such as the corporeality of God or incorporeality of God, the reality is that part of what our challenge as living as modern Jews is that we now know that even that which we know, we don't know. Now, because we know that which we know we don't know, it could lead somebody to argue, therefore, that if you basically don't know, then you might as well accept tradition as the resolution to that which you don't know. And therefore, tradition is there for the salvation, not of a pre-scientific mind, but of the post-scientific mind, who now knows that how subjective everything is. But when you do that, what you're sacrificing is not science, but your mind. We don't know what we know, but we know very often what we don't know. And at the end of the day, we are who we are. And just like a judge could only judge what they know at that given time, so could a human being only know what they could know at that given time. And therefore, at our given time, what I know is what I know. And therefore, I have to follow and interpret and live with my tradition on the basis of what it is that I know morally or intellectually at any given time. Knowing fully well that another generation is going to go a step further or a step backwards. And that's the process of a living covenant. You're not supposed to be a Jew as a 13th century or as a 23rd century. You're in the 21st century. What is it that you know? Within the context of knowing what you don't know. And that's that, and it makes it more difficult. The claim or the temptation that tradition is going to somehow bring to you this unique knowledge that you obviously don't know, but if you just say amen, now you know, is very, very enchanting. But since we know some things, the important thing is to know what we know and to try to create a tradition which fits in with that which we know, with all the imperfection in it. Why build such a dichotomy between the new and the old? You're absolutely right. Sometimes we don't have to. And whenever we can, and if you would continue to read the Laws Concerning to Slaves, chapter 9, Maimonides does a very interesting dance. He starts by saying that this is not the path of wisdom and piety, and then he goes back and quotes our sources. Now, one of the interesting questions that I want you to think about is, can you use tradition to heal itself? Can you heal itself? Can I use the notion of all human beings created in the image of God, love your neighbor as yourself, for example, to override Leviticus 18's notion that homosexuality is an abomination? Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Some people can, some people can't. But where you could do it as an internal Jewish conversation, it's obviously always better. And there's no reason to go outside. But sometimes you have to. And sometimes where you have to go outside is to make the decision to choose this chapter over the other chapter. Because if you're just walking inside, you're not going to know which one to use. And therefore you have to make a decision. Then after you make the decision, the language with which you express your decision is an internal one, even though you know honestly that the impetus for the decision started from the outside. And that outside was to pick this over that. Because if you don't have it, you're lost and stuck, right? What is Pardes? Pardes is actually traditionally was the first mystical study, or in the mystical tradition, Pardes, 4 enter the Pardes and only 1 comes out alive. Pardes is a dangerous place. Pardes is where you learn knowledge that not everybody should know. And one of the fears is that you're going to open doors of knowledge that you shouldn't have opened beforehand, and you have to be very, very careful. And so in the tradition, Rabbi Akiva is the only one, Rabbi Akiva is the only one who goes in and comes out of Pardes. The others either become heretics and die, etc. Maimonides shifts Pardes from some metaphysical issue from some mystical issue into the study of sciences and physics and metaphysics. That's his Pardes. Why, if we choose, why this, one second. Right, why be committed to this? There is no reason to be committed to this. You could, if you were born something else, you could have very easily have chosen something else. If I was born a Christian, I would have been doing the same thing as a Christian. And if I would be born a Muslim, I'd be doing the same thing as a Muslim. There is no outside reason why one tradition is preferable over the other. The only interesting question is that once something is your tradition, whether that tradition could be something that is sufficiently compelling that you want to stay with it. Most people don't choose their identity as if they're in a supermarket. You don't. And that's, in many ways, one of the great gifts of birthright, is that it creates at least a possibility of somebody saying, yeah, I'm in the story. You're not going to stay in the story. But there's no, it's just people don't live in we belong to families, to nations, to communities, to traditions, to pasts. The question is, we can get rid of our past, but it's still our past. The question is whether your past could also be part of your future. It's not necessary, but it still is an integral part of we're not identity tabula rasas, just sort of floating out there waiting for an identity to fall upon us. We'll stay within our identity if we could breathe. And Maimonides is an attempt to make a case for someone to be able to breathe. But you could do so just as well in any other tradition. Do the changes have to be always personal or communal? Really, really tough. When I am in my most noble moods, I believe that it has to be communal. But in order to breathe, I can't live there all the time. I can't be bound. I sometimes have to walk alone. That's the truth. I can't simply be lived. And I don't know what Maimonides would probably disagree. I don't know if he would disagree or because when he does his move in Talmud Torah, he's doing it for himself. So I feel I'm willing to keep stuff that the community needs, and I'll stay in the community, but as long as there's enough room for me to breathe. And so there too, that has to be a dance which can never be resolved. It's part, I'm obligated by both, but I can't just be a communal Jew and say, oh, I get all my meaning because I need to breathe. Me, Daniel, needs to breathe. And one of the reasons why I love Jerusalem is there's so much air in this 2 square miles. It is just, it's the oxygen level of these 2 miles is just remarkable. What would Maimonides believe about someone who's 1050? He believes that Torah has to speak to you. He might not want to speak to you. But Torah does. Torah does. He's interested in the other group. But Torah, and he writes a Torah for you. That's it. Maimonides writes a Torah for the 1050. He writes, I would get a 1050 that's why Jewish philosophy was great. It was the only subject that I didn't need an entrance exam to get into. If you wrote your name, you got in. Like spelling was just the core, of your name and your home address. But he would not want Judy. You're part of the Torah has to speak to you. And he's not trying, and this goes to the question of whether do I write about Maimonides writes of Judaism for the 1050s too. So that's what it means to be a part of a people, to build a Judaism that different types of people could live with. As the last question about Maimonides converting to Islam, touche on the ability to shock. I know you enjoy that. I know you very well. I don't think Maimonides converted. I don't think that's what I don't, but the truth is it's one of those things that I don't know. Nobody knows. It doesn't really matter to me that much. As to the issue of agunot, yes, that was one of, that for my father, who in the later stages of his life discovered issues of gender equality. And one of the primary reasons why he discovered them is because of my sister Tova, who really opened up a new avenue of what his moral responsibilities were. Responsibilities that that for most of his life he didn't write about, he didn't think about. My father was not a genderly equal person. He didn't grow up. That was just not the way he lived. He was a product of his time. But through my sister's teaching of him and her forcing him to see her, he began to see a whole new range of issues that he never spoke about. And therefore, at the end of his life, in The God Who Hates Lies, his story of moral responsibility was, of this, like Maimonides' slave story. Even though this is the law, it's not the path of wisdom or piety. For my father, that Torah's treatment of women was not the path of wisdom or piety. And he felt morally liberated once he discovered this problem, to speak out very, very clearly and to try to create a Judaism in which this would be rectified. It was a pleasure being with you this morning.